Joining us on the program is Jeenah, senior researcher at Mapungubwe Institute, South Africa. He is the former executive director of the Afro-Middle East Center. Pardon me on the name of the institute, Mapungubwe is what I was trying to say. Thank you for joining us, Naeem. My first question to you. The United Nations voted in a resolution, as you know, that called for an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict, if you will. Can you tell us how does this resolution impact the ongoing conflict, and what does this mean for the Palestinian people?
Well, firstly, let me say, I disagree with the term Israel-Hamas war. This is not an Israel-Hamas war. It's a war that Israel has launched against the Palestinian people, not against Hamas. In Gaza, the almost 20,000 people that have been killed are all civilians. In the West Bank, the hundreds of people have been killed where Hamas has no power and doesn't control everything, are mostly civilians. So it's a war that Israel has launched on the Palestinian people. The General Assembly resolution, unfortunately, has no weight of implementation. That only is with a Security Council resolution, and in the Security Council, the United States has repeatedly vetoed any resolution that calls for a ceasefire. Clearly the United States wants to give Israel free rein in order to continue its war crimes and its murder of civilians, etc. And basically, it's the another kind of Nakba. Displacement of Palestinians in Gaza.
Or gas and oil.
Made a reference to the U.S. vetoing. What is this relationship that we're seeing between Israel and the United States?
Well, it's a relationship that goes back. The United States was one of the first countries to recognize the state of Israel when the Zionist movement proclaimed it in May 1948, despite the fact that at the time it wasn't a member of the UN. Subsequently, when Israel was admitted to the United Nations, it was admitted on two conditions. One is that it would divide mandate Palestine into two, 55% of it what they called a Jewish state, and 45 an Arab state, as they called it, even though Jews made up only 30% of the population at the time. And the second condition was that Israel abided by Resolution 194, which granted Palestinian refugees the right to return. Israel to date refuses to acknowledge, let alone implement, either of those two resolutions. And so it's really illegitimately a member of the United Nations. But the relationship with the United States is a kind of mutual symbiotic one. It's one where the United States is able to essentially have an entire country as its military base and colony in the Middle East, which is a bit of a troublesome region for the US, but also a region with huge amounts of oil and gas. And having a kind of front base there is extremely useful. For Israel, it means that it gets almost unlimited amounts of weapons. It gets almost $4 billion a year in military aid, and now it's gone up to $14 billion because of what's happened in the past 2 months. And so it's a relationship that serves both parties. Also, in many ways, serves various European states. Let's remember that when Israel was created, it was created by white European Jews who felt that because of their persecution in Europe, they were not treated as white European enough. And if they had their own state, perhaps they could get treated as other white Europeans were. And so for many of the Europeans, including Balfour, Lord Balfour of the UK, who gave the assurance that a Jewish state would be created in Palestine, the creation of Israel was a way essentially to get rid of the Jews from Europe. And so the whole racist, colonialist enterprise that is Israel is in many ways a fault of the anti-Semitism of Europeans.
And you did mention something earlier about 1948. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the significance of 1948, the right of no return?
So in 1947, the United Nations passed this Resolution 181, which, without consulting any Palestinians, divided British Mandate Palestine into two. 55% they said would be a Jewish state, 45% an Arab state. And following on that, in 1948, 15th of May 1948, the Zionist movement declared Israel as a state. To date, for the past 75 years, Israel has not declared what its borders are. It's one of the only state in the world that hasn't declared what its borders are. But also importantly, in that period between 1947 and 1948, the Zionist movement organized in various militia, referred to called, for example, the Irgun and the Stern gangs. That's the names they gave themselves, undertook numerous pogroms against the indigenous Palestinian people. So in that period, 540 Palestinian villages and towns were destroyed. Almost 800,000 Palestinians were made into refugees. Many of them living now in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and many others relevant to what's happening now, living as refugees in the West Bank and in Gaza. So the population of Gaza, 2.3 million, 1.5 million of those 2.3 million are actually refugees. So in the earlier clip we heard, the Israeli spokesperson who talks about protecting the kibbutzes around Gaza, those kibbutzes were all Palestinian villages. I mean, the town of Sderot, which is very close, about 3 kilometers from Gaza, and regularly gets bombed. When fighters on the 7th of October invaded Sderot, for many of them, they were not invading anything. They were going home. That was the village of the Palestinian village of Najd, which was destroyed to create Sderot. The town of Ashkelon was the town of Asqalan, a Palestinian town that was destroyed to create this new town. All of those kibbutzes, kibbutz Be'eri, etc., were all villages, Palestinian villages that were destroyed around Gaza.
With the growing international calls for a ceasefire, how do you see the diplomatic efforts to address the Israel-Hamas conflict, especially considering the differing opinions within Israel and the international community?
Unfortunately, the so-called international community, including the United Nations, is essentially held to ransom by the United States on this issue. So the General Assembly can pass resolutions, but it doesn't have the power to implement those resolutions. Its resolutions are not regarded as part of international law. That only is applicable to Security Council resolutions. And as long as the United States maintains this unquestioning, uncritical support for Israel's genocide, we're not going to see any diplomatic efforts succeed. Israel can act with complete impunity because it knows that no other state can take action against it as long as the U.S. is on its side. I mean, where else have we heard of a state that bombs, in complete view of the entire world, bombs hospitals, besieges, bombs hospitals, allows babies to die and rot in the hospital, bombs UN schools and UN clinics, and admits to it without any shame, refers to UN staff as being terrorists, and then murders hundreds of them, as they did in Gaza, refers to the UN Secretary General as a terrorist, refers to the Security Council as enabling terrorism. I mean, Israel is the only state that is able to do this, and the only reason it's able to do this and get away with it, and know that it will get away with it, is because it has the United States on its side, and the United States has this veto in the Security Council. Until and unless the UN system and the Security Council in particular are reformed, this kind of impunity for war crimes and crimes against humanity will unfortunately continue.
And I want to talk about the two-state solution. First of all, could you explain what it entails and elaborate on the reactions from the British Prime Minister and the Israeli ambassador regarding a two-state solution.
So the two-state solution goes back to that 1947 Resolution 181 of the United Nations General Assembly that divided Palestine into two, as I said earlier on. Later, by the end of 1948, Israel had actually occupied not 55%, but 78% of the territory of Palestine. And then in 1967, occupied even the other 22%. So when the United Nations now talks about a two-state solution, they're not talking about that Resolution 181. They're talking about subsequent resolutions such as 242, which accepts that Israel can have 78% of Palestinian territory. So initially, 45% was given to Palestinians by the UN without consulting Palestinians. Then they reduced that to 22%. Subsequently, other Israeli leaders have tried to whittle that down further. In terms of the Oslo Accords, Palestinians control a fraction even of that in the West Bank, for example. Palestinians control less than 30% of the West Bank. And when I say control, it's not even real control. There is no Palestinian state that is sovereign, that is viable, etc. And so the UN position is that there should be what they call a two-state solution, where Israel will withdraw to the 67 armistice line, means that Israel will sit on 78% of Palestine, and Palestinians will be given only 22% of it, and Israel refuses to accept even that. In fact, as we saw with the Israeli ambassador to the UK, and virtually every single person who's in the current Israeli government, they're not interested at all in a Palestinian state. They're quite happy with the current situation, which is one where Israel controls the entire territory of Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, with different regimes of control. Within what they call Israel, it is a supposed democracy, for Jews only, of course. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians are regarded only as residents. In the West Bank, they're under a military occupation, where the land is under an ongoing colonization. In Gaza, they have been under siege for the past 17 years, and all of this is occupied territory, occupied by Israel. And the Israeli state is quite happy with that kind of a situation. They don't want to concede any inch of territory for a Palestinian state. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Britain, might mouth support for a two-state solution, but in every single act of his on this issue, it is clear that he unquestioningly, uncritically supports the Israeli state and will go along with whatever they want. The colonization of the West Bank, the siege of Gaza, their apartheid policies against their own Palestinian citizens. So 20% of Israel, 20% of the population is Palestinian, living under an apartheid.
Sorry, you did give mention to the Oslo Accord. A senior official recently for the Palestinian Authority insists that comments made by Netanyahu equating the Oslo Accords to what happened on October 7 confirms that his war against all Palestinians. Can you elaborate what your thoughts are on that?
So the Oslo Accords in 1993 were supposedly intended to be the first step towards a two-state solution, the creation of a Palestinian state, because of course an Israeli state already exists and controls all the territory. But from the Palestinian perspective, they made a number of concessions in order to realize that two-state solution. From the Israeli perspective, it is clear that from the very beginning, they had no intention of allowing the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state. Netanyahu's hyperbolic statements about Oslo and October the 7th just defied logic entirely. I mean, Oslo was an agreement, a deal made between Palestinians and Israelis, a very flawed deal from the Palestinian perspective, but a deal nevertheless. October 7th was the culmination of 75 years of occupation 17 years of siege. I mean, consider that most of those fighters that broke out of Gaza on the 7th of October, between the ages of about 18 and 25, had lived almost all their lives under siege in Gaza. And what they were doing was taking the first steps towards what they believe was the liberation of their territory. Under international law, an occupied population has the right to resist that occupation by whatever means are necessary. Under international law, a colonized population has the right to resist that colonization by whatever means necessary. And so that's what Palestinians did on the 7th of October.
Thank you very much for very clearly explaining a lot of that. Appreciate you so very much, Mr. Naim Jeenah.